And we're live in Westminster. With me today, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Andrew Mitchell, General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress Francis O'Grady, Labour MP Kim Leadbeater and commentator and broadcaster Emma Webb. Today, industry leaders are demanding immediate action amid soaring energy prices. But will the government step in?
The whole of government absolutely recognises the challenge that there is from these rising prices.
We'll have the latest on the government's plans, also today.
There is an unpleasant odour wafting out from under my party's front door. This is not who we are. This is not what global Britain is.
Andrew Mitchell led the rebellion against the decision to cut foreign aid spending. But is the government about to cut it further?
I'm absolutely delighted that the people of Batley and Spen have rejected division and they've voted for hope.
3 months on from a close-fought by-election, is Kim Leadbeater still hopeful about our politics? And is there ever a good time for a Prime Minister to take a holiday? Well, let's start the programme with that question and show you the Daily Mirror front page. Boris taking it easy again. The headline says, only here for the peer. That's a reference to Zach Goldsmith. The Johnsons are holidaying on the Costa del Sol. Of course, the Commons is in recess. Parliament isn't sitting. But is there ever a good time for a Prime Minister to go on holiday, particularly when, as many people would say, there's an energy crisis going on?
Well, there is never a good time, but you know, we should all insist that the Prime Minister has a holiday from time to time, because he'll be a better Prime Minister if he's able to get away with his family and have some downtime and relax, which he can never have when he's in London. So I'm pleased Boris has gone away. I think he'll come back with his batteries recharged when Parliament resumes next Monday.
Do you agree with that, Francis? Is there ever a good time for a Prime Minister to take a break?
Oh, I'm all in favour of the Prime Minister taking a break, and I'm all in favour of everybody taking their entitlement to a holiday. But let's be clear, this isn't your average Costa del Sol holiday, is it? It doesn't look great. It's a luxury villa owned by a mate at a time when everybody in Britain is feeling hammered by the cost of living crisis, and we've got real problems now in our supply chains, shortages, petrol, you name it. It doesn't look great.
Right, but is it a case of there always being a crisis, so there will never be a good time then for a Prime Minister to take some rest?
I think the Prime Minister should take a holiday. I don't know where the deputy is. There was a big fight over that job title, and no sign of the deputy stepping in. But there is a sensitivity issue. I mean, when we saw at Conservative Party conference people doing karaoke to the time of their lives on the day that universal credit was getting cut by £20 or 20%, I should say, you know, that sticks in the gut a bit, and I think people should be sensitive to how things look.
Kim, lots of MPs are on holiday because, as I say, Parliament isn't sitting, so many of them will no doubt be either staycationing or perhaps have gone abroad. So what do you think about the question for a Prime Minister to go on holiday? Is there ever a good time?
Everybody deserves a holiday, but as somebody who is currently struggling to find an hour off, never mind jumping on a plane and swanning off to my mate's private villa, I think it's difficult to be sympathetic to the Prime Minister at the moment. I'm in a school today speaking to teachers about how hard it is in education at the moment. I've had lots of calls recently with people working in the NHS, and I think sadly it is rubbing people's noses in it, you know, when the Prime Minister swans off on a jet plane to a private villa. I'm not sure this is the right time. I'm not sure there's ever a good time when you do a job of such a high pressure, but certainly now for me is not the right time.
Is it more to do with the timing or where he's gone? If he had gone on a staycation in England somewhere to a B&B, would that look better?
I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? Yeah, our friends' private villas, you know, makes it even worse probably. But also there's so much going on at the moment. You know, like I say, I'm struggling to find time to have an hour off with everything that I've got as a new MP. So certainly as the Prime Minister, as much as I think it is a fair point that people need to recharge their batteries. I just think the timing of this is particularly bad.
Emma, what do you think?
I think under the current circumstances, there's always a crisis. So it's going to be very difficult for the Prime Minister or even any senior minister to be able to take a holiday in a period that isn't a crisis. And being Prime Minister under the current circumstances, I imagine for Boris must feel very much like being a new mother, can't leave the country unattended for even a second before something else is going wrong. And I do agree, actually, that I think it's really important the Prime Minister is able to take a break so that he can come back with a fresh mind and allow things to settle. He must have a lot on his mind and on his plate at the moment. And it's a good thing for anybody, particularly if you're in a very high pressure job, to be able to take a break. But I think that the concerns that people are feeling and the reason why people seem to under these circumstances, the same as we've seen with other ministers in recent months. I think it's because it's quite clear that the current energy crisis and everything that's going on is so critical in the next couple of weeks that I think people are concerned that there's not really any time to waste.
All right, well, you mentioned the energy crisis. Of course, that is dominating the agenda here and everywhere. In fact, ministers are holding talks, will be, as industries hit by soaring energy costs make another appeal to the government for action and support. We're hearing from sectors like ceramics, paper and steel that they could be days away from halting production because of spiralling costs. Now, the government did meet. Ministers met on Friday, failed to get to a solution. The crisis also appears to have resulted in a dispute between departments at Whitehall. Let's have a look at the Metro headline. Look who's not talking. Kwasi Kwarteng there on the left says he's speaking with Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, to get support for business during energy crisis. The Treasury says he's not and accuses him of making things up in a Whitehall war of words. And then this is the slapdown headline here in the Daily Telegraph. The Treasury slaps down Kwarteng in energy row. Business Secretary accused of making up talks about bailout to keep factories open. Probably doesn't look that dignified while the energy crisis is going on. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Ione Wells. Give us the latest, Ione, on what has actually happened in this spat between the two departments.
Well, I think, as you said, there's a lot of drama being played out in the newspaper headlines about what really happened. Essentially, this all started because on the weekend, the Sunday papers reported that BEIS, the Department for Business, had asked the Treasury for billions to try and bail out some of these firms. Now, the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, denied that, said they haven't asked the Treasury for billions, but said that they were engaging with the Treasury and the Chancellor to try and kind of find a way out of this situation. Now, the Treasury then claimed that he was mistaken, that they hadn't been involved in any kind of talks about this, and that's what led to these sort of accusations of essentially the two departments being in some kind of spat. Now, what appears to have actually happened is essentially BEIS have been pretty clear that they haven't put forward a specific bid. They haven't asked the Treasury for any pot of cash yet. They are still very much in discussion with some of these firms about what kind of support they might need, whether any kind of existing support is sufficient or not. They are, however, saying that they are engaging Treasury officials throughout this process, and that's something which I understand is going on kind of behind the scenes. However, no official bid being put in yet, but I do understand that the Department for Business recognise the scale of this issue, are preparing to put forward some kind of bid to the Treasury at some point for support. The question is what exactly that will be, and they are still engaging with firms as we speak, really, to try and work out what solution might be needed.
Ione Wells, thank you very much. Andrew, Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has said the government is not in the business of bailouts. What help should it be in the business of offering?
Well, I think the distraction in the press about the processes, who's talking to who, should be put on one side. The government clearly has a role here, and it is to protect the taxpayer, it's to protect consumers, and it's also to protect jobs. What it shouldn't be doing is trying to bail out companies who are in the business of securing future supply. And while, you know, there may be a role for the government in providing some temporary loan finance, they should not be second-guessing business. It's business's job to make sure they secure these supplies, but it does have a role in protecting consumers.
Right. Would you be happy for some of those businesses and industries to go to the wall?
No, I wouldn't be happy, and I think that the market will have to work to shore them up, and there are a whole series of ways of doing that which do not directly involve the government.
Right, the General Secretary of the Unite Union, Francis, says workers are worried taxpayers be bailing out these industries.
Look, I think there's whatever spat's going on between departments, whoever's being economical with the truth, actually livelihoods are on the line, and as importantly, strategic industries for the country are on the line. There should be a plan. We need a clear industrial policy.
Is that a bailout?
Well, you can use words like bailout, but what's clear is that industries are going to need support through this period, and it's entirely predictable. Those industries, remember, this is manufacturing and our foundation industries, nearly 1 million people employed directly, many more down the supply chains indirectly dependent on those industries. It matters for our balance of trade, it matters for the future prosperity of this country, and we've argued for a short-time working scheme so that it's a something for something arrangement, as you see in many other countries, to get those companies through temporary difficulties.
So you do think it's temporary then?
Well, we hope so, don't we? We've seen those energy prices soar. We need action from the government to deal with that. But in the short term, what we don't want to see is good companies and good jobs going to the wall in parts of the country that are really, really dependent on those jobs, communities that will suffer if we don't act.
Right, so both of you seem to be saying there should be short-term help. Is that in the form of billions of pounds of loans to these companies to help them through the winter?
No, I mean, in my view, the market is where this will be sorted out, and companies are in the business.
But what if they go to the wall in the next few days? Some of them are saying they're going to have to halt production.
Then there may have to be mergers and other market-based solutions. But I do think, in the end, if necessary, the government could be a provider of temporary finance, if necessary. But it's for the market to sort it out. And as you so rightly said, we are talking here about taxpayers' money.
Right, but it's a 250% increase, I think, is the figure in the price of wholesale gas this year. Surely some of these companies and sectors and industries are the victims of the very market you're talking about.
No, it's at the very heart of the way these businesses run their affairs, that they hedge future risk and they take long-term contracts. So it's in the market that the future solutions are going to be found.
Right, Kim, we're a couple of weeks away from the spending review and the budget, and the Treasury is being lobbied for cash from all sides, including from the Business Department. Should these energy-intensive industries now be top of the list for help?
Goodness me, there's a long list. That's the problem, isn't it? There's a lot to do, but certainly we cannot stand by. The government must not stand by and let these important industries go to the wall, because ultimately, you know, we must have seen some of this coming. This can't have just been, we didn't wake up one day and this happened. This is what worries me about the lack of planning from the government in terms of issues like this. We're always catching up, aren't we? We're never getting ahead of the game. And in the middle of that are consumers who are paying the price, jobs that are at risk. And I think it's really important that the government has a very intensive period now of working with businesses, listening to businesses, instead of falling out amongst itself, which is what seems to be happening over the weekend.
Right, Emma, whose fault is this, or who has the responsibility for sorting it out, businesses or government?
Well, I agree with Andrew. I think that ultimately both the Chancellor and the Business Secretary don't want the government to have to bail them out. I do think this is something that you know, a bailout or any kind of financial assistance at the cost of the taxpayer should be, you know, absolutely the very last solution. I think that, you know, this is very important, and it's very important for the Conservative Party as well. Even if you think just back to Boris's speech at the Conservative Party conference and all of this emphasis on levelling up and, you know, harking back to the old Northern powerhouse. This is an industry that is worth billions, tens of billions, and employs hundreds of thousands of people, particularly in the north, in the Humber, in Teesside, in Scotland. So the government is going to have to do something. But also, I think it's important to recognise that the government does have some responsibility for this. There have been critics for a long time who have been pointing out that one of the reasons why these industries are struggling is because of heavy tax burdens, particularly from the climate crisis agenda, and that they're being really overburdened with a number of taxes that in circumstances like these could possibly be relaxed as a matter of emergency. But ultimately, what I've been hearing from other people who are critical of the idea of a bailout is that it may just simply be too late to save these industries with emergency measures. Otherwise.
Let me, Frances, lower taxes on industry.
I think the key point here is that the government needs to respond to a call that the TUC and those industries have been making for months now, which is call us in, get us around the table. We saw how well that worked when it came to creating the furlough scheme to get us through a major crisis in this country. This is not on the same level, but it's really, really important to those workers and those communities. It makes a big difference as to whether these industries survive.
Right, and if you were around that table, what would you be suggesting?
So we would be looking at the full range of interventions and support that could be made. But as I say, the TUC has argued, let's have a ready-made scheme so that everybody knows where they stand, that when, just like we have in other countries, when we face a crisis, when we face temporary difficulty, let there be some something for something support, that it's conditional on protecting jobs and skills, but will help those companies get through with a short time working scheme.
Would you welcome that sort of scheme being there on the table for sectors who are struggling now and any more?
Well, I think talking around a table is a good thing to do. And as I say, I think the solutions to this, perhaps a little late in the day, but the solutions are clearly there. And they are market-based, with the government facilitating. But at the end of the day, the government is not there to featherbed these industries, and taxpayers' money must be protected. But they're certainly there to facilitate. And as I say, it is to protect consumers, and certainly to protect jobs, and certainly to protect a strategic industry.
Right, there is a political point which Emma was suggesting, and also your Conservative colleague, Andrew Percy, has said if the government doesn't intervene here, then it will amount to an abandonment of the North and Midlands, the levelling up areas where heavy industry and manufacturing is primarily located. Is he right?
Well, the government clearly is intervening, and it's the question of the way it intervenes. And what the government mustn't do is to pick winners or interfere in a market that is capable of resolving these things itself.
Sadly, they're not intervening, are they? They're squabbling currently, and that's why I think it really makes sense. Let's grow up, frankly, get around the table and put saving those livelihoods and those firms first.
The system will operate properly. You know, the business department will put forward proposals, and the Treasury will then argue with them and decide whether they should proceed.
Have they been a bit slow in their response, the government?
Well, they may have been, but they're certainly not now. I think these discussions are taking place as we sit here speaking.
Kim?
No, I agree, slow in their response, and as Francis says, too busy falling out amongst themselves on this issue. You know, I'm not an expert in energy, but there are people who are. Let's get those people around the table and let's have a two-way discussion about what the best thing to do is to get through this crisis, and hopefully it is a short-term crisis. But you've got to do that with open, honest dialogue and conversations with the people who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis.
Right, but the problem is if it isn't short-term, the price of energy looks like it will remain volatile throughout the coming year, Francis, and one of your solutions, no doubt, is using taxpayers' money to bail out business, certainly in what could be the medium term.
We've always looked at this really carefully in terms of cost to the taxpayer and cost to the country if we end up with mass unemployment and important strategic industries going down. We'll end up importing goods, not great for the climate either. So we have to look at this in the round. And what's clear is that I think most sensible people know that these industries do have a future. They need short-term help. And, you know, we've got some practical proposals about how we secure that. I just want the government to listen to business, but also to unions, because we have a real stake in this. As Sharon rightly said, a lot of working people are worried sick that they're going to end up unemployed, and that waste of skills and talent will be a waste for the whole country.
Why not ease the burden of tax on these energy-intensive industries, Andrew? Would that be a good idea?
Well, it might be a possible temporary measure, but I think, you know, the government's got to make sure that the market works, we get the result that we want, and the government is there as a last resort, not a first resort, to do what is necessary to achieve that.
Right. Let's just have a look. I think the Business Secretary has just put out a tweet to do with supply chains. We may be able to show it. Oh, we don't have it just yet. I'll show it to you in just a minute. One of the other things that we wanted to talk about is this in the Sun newspaper, which has End Green Tax. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, urged to end eco-taxes to help Brits over the energy crisis. Emma, is that something you'd be in support of?
Absolutely. We have some of the highest electricity prices in Europe, in the world, in Asia. It's very difficult for our industry to be able to compete under the current circumstances. And that is because of decisions that our government has taken, because they want to be at the forefront of sort of spearheading the climate the fight against climate change in comparison to other countries. And it's one of the reasons, and it's been pointed out time and time again, that the tax burden on these industries is extremely high, and they're not being protected from some of the things that are outside of the government's control, like the global energy crisis, the fact that there is a shortage of supply, and innumerable things that are outside of our control. But the things that are within our control, like taxes, are something that we should be looking into. And to me, it seems nonsensical. It doesn't seem sensible to tax these industries up to their eyeballs and then to bail them out when they fail as a result. So I think that we should be trying to make their operation costs as low as possible, whilst the market can sort itself out.
Right. Kim, what do you think? Is that something that you would back too? VAT cut or ending green levies to make higher energy bills more affordable?
I think anything that comes at this from an environmental angle is obviously really useful and really vital and valuable. And I think we have to look at whatever action needs to be taken in the short term to get through this crisis. And if this is part of that package, then I think it definitely needs to be on the table.
For the medium and longer term, what we actually need is investment in those industries. Many of them are already incredibly energy efficient, but to take the next leap to meet those climate change targets, they are going to have to develop new technologies and apply them. That takes time, and they're probably going to need, or definitely will need, a proper industrial strategy, a framework within which they can do that, so they have the certainty to make the investments it takes.
Is the tweet from the business secretary. He says industry has come to an agreement to guarantee the supply of CO2 to business without further taxpayer support. This deal will protect critical sectors over the coming months, all possible thanks to our original time-limited support. Time-limited, probably doing quite a lot of heavy lifting. It doesn't sound like there is going to be much in the way of taxpayer bailout, Andrew.
Well, we'll see. I mean, you said should the taxes, the green taxes, be lowered for consumers?
And should they?
And you're right in saying the government's top task is to protect consumers. But we have competing agendas here. Moving into COP26 in Glasgow next month, Britain actually is doing pretty well in meeting its green targets. And part of the reason is because we've had this levy on energy. So we mustn't knock one agenda by looking for a different agenda. We've got to do all these things very carefully. So I would not be in favour, as a knee-jerk reaction at the moment, of making an immediate lowering of the green taxes.
All right, we're going to talk about overseas aid. As you will know, the government has decided to cut aid spending from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5% earlier this year. This is a story, though, in The Guardian that says the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is to save billions by counting IMF, International Monetary Fund, cash as aid for poor. This is a windfall from the IMF worth about £20 billion, some of which the Treasury is going to plan to recycle as aid spending. The Guardian is reporting that Rishi Sunak has chosen not to make use of the funds additional to the existing aid budget, which some other countries are doing. What do you make of that decision, Andrew?
Well, the position is this, that there's a G7 finance ministers meeting this week, and I think that 7 of which Britain has the chair, should decide that this, at this time of pandemic, at this time when we are desperate to make sure that vaccinations reach the poorest in the world, we should be generous. And so I think that all this expenditure should be on top of what is now 0.5. In my view, it was quite wrong to lower the level from 0.7 to 0.5, particularly in the middle of a global pandemic, and particularly when Britain has the chair of the key rich countries and therefore the ability to make things happen for the poorest. So I think that the Chancellor should be generous. I think at the G7 he should lead from the front. Every other G7 country is increasing its support to the poorest. None of the others are seeking to cheese-pair over this extra money. And I think the Chancellor should make a big, bold British leadership initiative this week to say that all this money should be in addition to the development budget.
Emma?
I think there's definitely a point to be made. We were talking before in a different context about competing agendas, that one thing that is very important to us after Brexit, with the idea of global Britain, is that, you know, aid spending is part of that. And there has been a shift since DFID was founded towards a more strategic understanding of the way that aid budgets should be used and the way that they should be spent. And so, you know, I do think that that is something that we should recognise. However, under the current circumstances, you know, we've just been talking about the energy crisis, the ways in which people are suffering here. And actually, when you look at the polling, public opinion on this, polling from YouGov from 2020 suggested that the British public were very much in favour of the spending cuts. The polls that have followed that have shown that has slightly fallen somewhat, and people might be a little bit more in favour of spending more money on aid, but not substantially. It's still one of the most unpopular forms of government spending. And I think that under the current circumstances, I think the cut in the first instance was the right decision. I think that the Chancellor's statement that he was doing this only temporarily until we got ourselves in a better economic position coming out of the pandemic, that seems very sensible to me, and I think it will seem very sensible to many members of the public. And as I say, going back to those polls, the government also need to be conscious of the fact that within those polls, amongst Conservative voters, it was almost universal that people were against those cuts.
Right. Andrew?
Well, you have to be very careful of the polling, because the polling moves up and down. But the one poll that sticks in my mind was that 94% of the British public are not in favour of cutting humanitarian aid. And that is the aid that has been cut. So you're literally taking the food off the plates of starving people. You're cutting British endeavour for girls and women to make their lives, really awful lives, better, and 94% of the British public think it is wrong to cut that, and that is the aid that's been cut. And remember, this is not a budget that is only altruistic. It's a budget which is the right thing to do, but it's also a budget which makes Britain itself more prosperous and safer by helping people deal with conflict in very poor countries and having an agenda to make them more prosperous. We make ourselves safer and more prosperous in Britain.
Emma?
I absolutely take your point. I just think that under the current circumstances, that I can imagine, as I say, we've been talking about the energy crisis, and there's so much suffering going on here. And with this suggestion of using this IMF money, incorporating it in the aid budget, it's not something that it's not a completely absurd idea. It's an established rule that 30% of that could be used within the aid budget anyway. So, this is just the Chancellor attempting to save us a little bit of taxpayer money, but actually just by incorporating that into the aid budget, that, as you say, is already reduced anyway.
Kim, what's your response? Chancellor saving the taxpayer money.
I agree really strongly with Andrew on these points. I was extremely upset to see the scrapping of the Department for International Development, and I was totally against reducing the international aid contributions. And I think, again, as Andrew has alluded to, this is about humanitarian aid. It's not about anything other than having human beings whose lives are in danger and who are really, really struggling in some of the worst places in the world. And sadly, as a result of the cut, we've seen many projects already having to be scrapped or slashed in some of the most desperate places around the world, including places like Yemen. I was particularly proud of the work that we did through the Joe Cox Foundation in giving money to projects through DFID for over 30 projects around the world, looking at women's empowerment and looking at some of the most difficult communities around the world. So I think that money needs to be reinvested. It needs to put back up to the 0.7 as soon as is possible. And I think, this is about how we view ourselves in the world. Are we looking inward or are we looking outward? And the way forward is to be global Britain. We need to look at, the role that Britain can play in making the world a better place, as Andrew said, a safer place. And I think that's what this government is getting wrong at the moment. We're doing too much looking inward, we need to look outward.
Right, Francis, as you know, the government says the reduction is temporary and that they will reverse it once certain fiscal conditions are met.
Yeah, and the point about the IMF money is, of course, not against the rules. It just looks shabby. It's a bit like being in mass and putting a tenner in the collection plate and taking £5 back. It just feels wrong. But I think it's not only a moral question, it is also about a false economy, because if a lot of the problems we face in the world are rooted in global inequality. Men, boys, in getting a better life, then those problems of COVID, of climate change, of mass migration, because people are desperate to find a better life, will still be there. So aid for the right things going to the right people has a really important role to play.
All right, just before we move on, Andrew, as a former International Development Secretary, now, of course, that post is no longer here. Do you think Liz Truss, the new Foreign Secretary, is going to be an ally? She was reported as saying at the weekend that actually she'd quite like that spending back. She does see the sort of advantage of soft power.
Yes, I do. I think that she understands the use of soft power, and she understands this vital point that if you slash soft power, you inevitably get into situations where hard power is necessary, which wouldn't be if you still had a proper development budget. But there's an example today. The government is planning to vital international development work around the world. It frees up areas for agriculture so people can feed themselves. And, you know, the final sort of insult is it's cut the whole demining programme in Zimbabwe, where Zimbabwean deminers have been working in the Falkland Islands and have at last made the Falkland Islands completely demined.
All right, we're going to move on. I'd like to welcome Luke Trill. He is the UK Director of More in Common. Hello to you, Luke.
Hi.
You've got new research out today about what people in the UK think of democracy. What did you find?
We do. Well, as we all know, our democracy has had a lot on its plate in the past 5 years with Brexit, the pandemic, shortages, lockdowns. And so we wanted to find how well it was holding up with all of that. And there's good news. Britons remain strongly committed to our democracy. 9 in 10 say that democracy is the best way to run the country. 2/3 think that Britain is a genuine, open democracy. But there was bad news too, and that's because the way our democracy is working in practice is leaving a lot of people feeling let down. It's really striking that 84% of the people that responded to our survey said that they thought that politicians looked down on them. And significant majorities also agreed that there was one rule for politicians, one rule for everyone else. And there's also a growing feeling that we got from our focus group discussions that people think that the democratic system's rigged against them, that it doesn't deliver for them, it's not making a positive change in their lives. So optimism about democratic principles and pride in our democratic heritage, but a really worrying trend of disillusionment in how it's working out in practice.
I mean, how do views on democracy in the UK compare with other Western countries?
So the good news is that we have that strong commitment to democracy, which you don't necessarily see everywhere around the world. For instance, we looked at attitudes in France, in Germany and the US. And when you look at France, actually people are much more likely to consider non-democratic alternatives than in the UK. In the US, they're more likely to think that democracy is rigged against them and that it's not a genuine democracy. But what's really striking is that compared to our European partners, people in the UK are more likely to say that politicians themselves look down on them as ordinary members of the public. And that's a really worrying disconnect because it creates the space for populist authoritarians to come in and say, we will deliver the will of the people. And as we saw on January the 6th in the US, when you reach that sort of critical mass who feel left behind, who feel politics isn't working, you can have quite violent and extreme consequences. So we hope that this is a wake-up call to politicians to say, our democracy is in okay shape, people are committed to the principles, but if that disengagement continues, if that distrust continues, there could be quite worrying consequences further down the line.
All right, well, let's talk to our politicians first about that. Do you agree with that critique, Andrew?
I think it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? I mean, someone once said that democracy is the worst system apart from all the others, and I think it's good to hear that the research suggests that there's approval of democracy. I think in a free society, politicians are always looked down on to some extent by the public, and they're held to account, and it's very important that we have a rugged, cynical, cacophonous media to hold politicians to account. So I'm disappointed to hear that people think that politicians look down at them. I think that we are all of us the servants of our constituents, and if that is the result of your research, then we must look at ways of addressing that. I do think that populism has clearly been rampant around the world recently. We live in an age where the international system is under great pressure. Narrow nationalism and populism is on the march. and I regret that very much. And I also think that in Britain we are continuing to move towards a more presidential system. And we have, in British democracy works on the basis that the Prime Minister is the first among equals. And I think that we need structures and mechanisms which put more power back into Parliament and make the Premiership less presidential. And I hope that there's quite a lot of us in Parliament who are worried about that. And I hope it's going to be an agenda that's going to emerge over the next year or so.
Kim, do you agree with the critique from Luke?
I think it's a brilliant piece of research, and well done to everybody at More in Common for doing it. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons I chose to put myself forward to enter politics, because I think there's so much that needs to be done around engaging people with politics nationally and locally. I feel really passionate about the issue of political literacy. I'm in a school today talking to young people about what democracy is and how it operates, where decisions are made, and we don't know enough about that, I think. I mean, it amazed me during the by-election. We had a 47% turnout, and apparently that's really good. Well, what concerns me is what those 53% of people, why are they not coming out and voting? Why do they not feel that politics matters enough to them to go out and put their mark on the ballot paper? So I think there's a really big piece of work to be done around political literacy, political engagement, getting people into politics from different backgrounds, again, which is one of the reasons I put myself forward, you know, and just that disconnect between constituencies and communities like mine in Batley and Spen and the corridors of power. So I think research like this is really important, but I think the thing is now is what do we do with it, and what responsibility have we got as politicians to make sure that people do understand how important it is to their lives, and part of that is our responsibility to how we behave and how we interact with people. You know, I'm spending all my time at the minute, every minute, going out and speaking to people on the ground, whether it's people working in schools or the NHS or local businesses. We've got to have that piece of engagement there to help people understand how important it is to their lives.
All right, Luke, you're nodding away. Just a brief response from you, and then I'll open it up.
No, I mean, I think Kim's hit the nail on the head. And one of the things which we say as a way forward in this report is really improving schools' role in things like citizenship, education, making sure that young people know that sometimes people will have different views from them, and it's important to consider them, engage with them and respect them. Because actually the poll found that Gen Z, which is those who are aged under 25, were the most likely to think that people who disagreed with them were wrong on the facts rather than just having a different opinion. So we think there's a really important role for schools, as Kim said, in educating young people about the importance of appreciating others' points of view and taking part in democracy as well.
Right, but one of the other responsibilities is, of course, during things like elections and by-elections. And, Kim, you received some awful abuse during your by-election campaign. But Labour were also criticised for using leaflets showing Boris Johnson with the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and the phrase, "Don't risk a Tory MP who is not on your side." Modi is a Hindu nationalist, and that was seen by some as an attempt to get Muslim voters on side. Is that sort of divisive tactic really helpful in terms of engaging the public?
I think we do have to look at how we campaign. And I mean, on that particular incident, you know, we were looking at this from a humanitarian perspective. But I think you're right about the broader point about how we campaign and how we conduct ourselves during the by-election. And because I was subjected to such horrible abuse and nastiness, it's really difficult to not get drawn into that yourself. And I tried my best personally and through the party campaign to rise above that. But it is difficult when other people are, you know, going low. We do need to try and go high, and that's what we certainly tried to do. Right. I don't think that's helpful, and it just disengages people.
Francis?
I'd talk about some bread and butter issues. For me personally, I worry about requirements for voter ID, making it more difficult for people, especially if they're not in safe housing, to vote. I think that's something to guard against. But I also think we need to talk about trust and honesty and integrity, because I think that does matter in politics. And I suspect there is a lot of cynicism at the moment about some of those contracts that went along the VIP track during the COVID crisis. A lot of people were stepping up in the COVID crisis to do our best for each other, and other people were making a hell of a lot of money. And I think people feel resentful about that, and we need that public inquiry to establish the truth of the matter.
Emma, what's your response? You're an advocate for free speech. Should political debate be dialed down in general?
Well, I think these findings are all very fascinating, but the one thing that I really picked out of this as most concerning to me was those statistics around Generation Z, suggesting as we see quite often in public debate, the assumption that your opponent is just simply factually wrong, or sometimes, you know, demonizing your opponent, assuming that they are bad people because they don't share your views. And the Free Speech Union do an incredible amount of work advocating for civil discussion, in the sense of advocating for people to be able to express their views freely and openly without fear. And I think that's really important. And some of the recommendations that I saw from this study, focusing on education, but also focusing on the conduct of MPs, in the sense of, I personally, I think that it would be good for people to try and demonstrate the sort of society that we would like to become. And so being respectful of other people's views, not trying to silence our opponents, not straw manning them, and instead steel manning them, and behaving with good faith, and trying not to enter into these sort of mudslinging matches. So I think that actually what I've taken away from this is that, you know, my fears have been confirmed in some respects, but it's only made me more sort of bolstered in my belief that it's really important for us to continue advocating for free speech.
Right. I mean, France has raised this issue about trust and integrity. You've written a book, Andrew, Beyond a Fringe, and the idea of trust in institutions is a major theme in your book. And you've been part of pretty well every institution, part of the establishment, from your school to Cambridge to Army to the city to politics. And yet you say you resigned from the establishment. Why?
Well, the subtitle is Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey, and I think the establishment has changed an awful lot in recent years. But I should say, you know, it's the book and entertain and talk about some of the changes that have taken place in the establishment over the last 30 or 40 years.
Right, but was part of it, you devote a chapter of your book to the fallout following an altercation with a police officer outside the gates at Downing Street. What was that the big moment? Did that have the impact on your life that left you...
Much more, actually, out of the work I did on international development, starting back in 2005, when I saw the way in which the establishment in Britain did certain things which I thought were quite wrong. I mean, one of the worst, I thought, to begin with, was Tony Blair's suggestion that we should lock people up for 90 days without charge as part of the war against terror, so-called. And I thought that was a terrible way to proceed in a free society where civil liberties and human rights really matter.
Right, well, then, how do you imagine ordinary people feel? And when I say ordinary people, like me, voters, if you're feeling sceptical about the establishment because of the things you've just said, how should they feel?
Well, we should all feel sceptical, I think, and that's one of the reasons why I say in the book that having a really cacophonous, cynical, loud press keeps people straight.
Who are you thinking of?
It keeps politicians and ministers, it keeps business people with power straight, and it's also partly the answer to what Francis said about these contracts. You know, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Is he a reformed lackey?
I was just wondering whether the establishment has changed that much. I mean, we know that, you know, hedge funds and private equity have much more power than they used to. But that dominance of privately educated Oxbridge graduates in government and across, you know, our judiciary...
It's a lot less dominated
media, than it was. You know, where we know you're at least twice as likely to get to the top if you went to private schools. So, and particular public schools, by the way, like Eton. But...
Well, 4 of the last 5 Prime Ministers came from Oxford.
Yeah, and I think what's really hard is when these are the people who are taking decisions, for example, to cut in real terms public service and key workers' pay, or to take away universal credit from the poorest. That gap between the life experience of those running those institutions and the rest of us just feels so wide and hurtful, and makes a lot of people angry and sometimes use industrial language.
Thanks to all of my guests. That's all we have time for today. I will, of course, be back at the same time tomorrow at 12:15. Thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.